Well, hello, and this is the Lenten study on the Psalms at the Greencastle Presbyterian Church. And so, welcome, and we're going to turn today to Psalm 132. Now, nostalgia is when we're reflecting back on the good old days, which we do sometimes in family circles around our tables. Remember when, or do you remember? And sometimes they're funny, and sometimes they're very endearing, and sometimes embarrassing. I know a lot of folks like to go to oldies concerts. Concerts now are like the Beatles. Or some people like to hear doo-wop music, which is way, way back. The people who actually attended the Woodstock Festival in 1969, they're in their 70s and 80s. Oh my. There's actually a summer outdoor music series in a local park nearby. And every year, towards the end of August, they have a 1940s festival. And people are listening to big band music. They're in cosplay wearing zoot suits, which are really the craziest thing. World War II Army uniforms, girls wearing dresses of the era, putting their hair up like the stars of the day way back when, and then big shoulder pads on their dresses. Of course, we repeated that in the 80s too. In Psalm 132, the theme is not nostalgia. It's a psalm that asks God to remember the promises God made to David, their hero king, of their history and also of their hopes and dreams. The Psalm 132, in the genre of psalms, is a royal psalm. It does extol the king and the kingdom of David, but it's also a psalm that appeals to God for a better future, just like when David was on top of the world. So the psalm is actually divided into two sections. Verses 1 to 10 are a prayer for the Lord to remember David, their king, and his desire to build a dwelling place, the first temple for the Lord. David was not permitted to build the temple because the prophet Nathan told him God considered him a man of blood. He was a man of war, a lot of blood in his hands. His son Samuel got to build it. Now, the rest of the psalm, verses 11 through 18, that's a poetic rendering of the promise or the oath that God swore to David, which you can find in this chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, that one of his sons would always occupy the throne forevermore. Now, the Davidic line died out in the Babylonian captivity, which is around 586. I'm sure there was some people related, but, they were not on the throne. But it's a hope, and the Psalms of Ascent reflect in song the hopes and the dreams as well as the fears of the people as they're making their way to the temple for one of the yearly festivals. It's also the longest of the Psalms of Ascent, so it's a long song with many verses. So let's read the psalm. I'll read it from the New International Version. I can read it from the New King James as well. And it goes, Lord, remember David and all his self-denial. He swore an oath to the Lord. He made a mighty vow to the mighty one of Jacob. I will not enter my house or go to my bed. I will not allow sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids till I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling for the mighty one of Jacob. We heard it in Ephratah. We came upon it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool, saying, Arise, Lord, come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. May your priests be clothed with your righteousness. May your people sing for joy. May for the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed one. The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath he will not revoke. One of your own descendants I will place on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on the throne forever and ever. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place, saying, This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant provisions. Her poor I will satisfy with food. I will clothe her priests with salvation, and her faithful people will ever sing for joy. Here I will make a horn grow for David, and set up a lamp for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but his head will be adorned with a radiant crown. Well, David is a man after God's own heart, and we read that also in 1 Samuel in the 13th chapter. And David's life is characterized by all of these daring exploits worthy of any movie thriller. He did possess remarkable leadership, shrewd statesmanship. As a king, he takes Israel from a loosely organized tribal grouping to become a serious nation and a highly organized monarchy. He was also a deeply spiritual man who loved the Lord. He had a heart for God and worshiped God with just exuberance, with joy. And many of the Psalms are attributed to David. So David was really blessed to rise to the stature of the throne of Israel when Israel was in its ascendancy. And he is just full-blooded, God-intoxicated, just, an incredible man of the Bible. And he's a real person. He's a human being like us who operated as a king as things are in transition from an iron age into a more sophisticated age. And this is the era when the Greek philosophies are coming into the fore. It's an area when other faith traditions are now in their infancy. Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, when Rome is being founded. And he's just mostly typifying what a person who walks with God experiences. He's just fully alive and just fully human, and he's a man after God's own heart. Because Israel wanted the king, they got Saul, and this is an aside, they went with trait characteristics. If you read it in 1 Samuel, Saul was tall, they like tall people, he had great hair, and he looked the part of a king. Unfortunately, he was a man who emotionally was, deeply compromised, would be a nice way to say it. But in David, they get a real fully alive human being with skill and with understanding. Although his life is also flawed. And Scripture tells the story of how his life falls apart spiritually, emotionally, even physically, just like ours. Nonetheless, our ancient pilgrims to the temple rejoiced in King David's personal commitment to God and to the glory that he brought to God's people and to the kingdom of Israel, and for his seeking to provide a home for God's holy presence where God would dwell and where they would gather in worship and praise of God and give thanks to God, confess their sins, receive forgiveness, and recommit themselves to the worship of God. So the story of David's life as a whole is really not in his heroic deeds. It's actually in his leadership of Israel to greatness. And it's not even about his flawed life, but more importantly, it's the story of God's grace and God's mercy and God's forgiveness and hope, but also the promise of a messianic son of David who would be God's chosen and would restore things to the way God intended. That's where this psalm speaks to the kingdom that Jesus proclaimed and to the kingdom that Jesus embodies. And while this kingdom is not here in its fullness, it is here. It's in our hearts. And when we live as though the kingdom was a reality for everyone, life gets better for everyone. And still we long for the day when everything is put right, when the world can live in peace under the umbrella of God's justice and mercy. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians, and he uses that unique word, Maranatha, Lord, come. So that's where this psalm takes us. I hope you'll read it and have a little fun with it and maybe even compose a song. Or just think about your own longings, not the nostalgia. I mean, if you like doo-wop music or Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young from 1969 or Carole King from 1970, I'm giving my age away here, or, trying to think of someone in the 80s or 90s, techno music. That was never my thing. Maybe it's yours. But I think this is more important. This is the longing for the day when God will put everything right. So have fun with it. I'll be back with Psalm 133.